good evening as people are coming into the room. Great to see people this evening. So my name is Jennifer New, and I'm the Associate Director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. And welcome to the first Obermann Conversation of spring semester. So we will be heading into that in just a moment, but we have a few announcements first. So I'm excited to say that we have a pop-up Obermann conversation. We do these occasionally to respond to something going on in the world. And so we're going to do one about what is occurring right now in Ukraine. And that is on February 16th, which is a Wednesday. So I think that's 2 Wednesdays from now. However, instead of the 7 o'clock time, it's from 5 to 6 p.m. So 5 to 6 o'clock, February 16th. And we will have 3 people who are intimately involved with Ukraine and that part of the world, helping us to better understand what's happening there. So tonight, we are going to be hearing about reproductive justice, and also one other announcement from Jason. So the Obermann Center is very pleased to do these conversations in partnership with the Iowa City Public Library. And specifically, I get to work with Jason Polios, and he has a quick announcement as well before we head in.
Yes, thank you to Obermann. Thank you to all the panelists here tonight. Just really quickly wanted to say, as we're kicking off Black History Month, you can find out more about events that the library is hosting at icpl.org/BHM for simplicity. It'll take you to all the events, and then also book lists on the website for all ages for finding a good read or watch for Black History Month. And a reminder, we're wrapping up a winter reading program that's for all ages as well. That ends February 12th. If you're an adult, you only need to have read 2 books since the middle of December. Hopefully we all accomplish that goal. I did just recently. So you'll get a mug, you'll get cocoa or tea. So come on by the library, any public service desk, and we'll get you set up. The kiddos, we just need 20 books having been read. That's like less than a book a night. You got that. Come on in and get a mug with cocoa. So thank you so much.
That's great. I'm wondering if I go in, if I have to give like some kind of like short explanation of my book to prove that I've read it. No. Okay. All right.
No test.
So jumping into this conversation tonight. So I am very happy to introduce 2 University of Iowa faculty with whom the Obermann Center is so pleased to be involved with. So Natalie Fixmer-Arise has a joint appointment in communication studies and gender, women's, and sexuality studies. Her 2019 book, which won, I know, several major awards, is titled Homeland Maternity, U.S. Security, Culture, and the New Reproductive Regime. And it traced the discursive alignments between motherhood and nation and homeland security culture. She is speaking tonight with Lena Maria Murillo, who also has a joint appointment in history and gender, women's, and sexuality studies. Lena is completing her first manuscript, Fighting for Control, Reproductive Care, Race, and Power in the US-Mexico Borderlands. And together, the 2 of them co-direct one of our Obermann working groups, which is called Reproductive Justice. And they had the opportunity to write a chapter in a book that you're going to be hearing more about from them in a moment. And they did it all via Zoom and in the midst of the pandemic and parenting and in record time. So so I'm going to let the two of them tell you more both about that experience and then the chapter that came out of that, because we'll be hearing from three of the people who they featured in that chapter. So we'll hear from each of them and their guests, and then toward the end, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So thank you, Lena and Natalie.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you so much for inviting us to have this conversation. Thanks to the Obermann Center and to Jason for the planning and the logistics that went into this event. I'm so glad I don't have to manage the technology tonight. And I also wanted to extend incredible gratitude to our extraordinary panelists tonight, Lastasia, Megan, and Nicole. Lena will introduce all of them in a moment, and we'll get to hear about some of the work, the very important change-making work that they're doing here in Iowa. And I wanted to thank everyone who's showing up virtually for this event tonight to have this conversation. We look forward to having it with you. The conversation tonight has really been sparked by the work that's being done that Lena and I have this working group. We're really fortunate to have all of these panelists who show up to our working group. It's a group that gathers faculty, students, healthcare providers, advocates locally on campus, but also across the region to talk about reproductive justice. Every month we gather. And the conversation tonight in the book chapter was really sparked by the extraordinary work that our colleagues are doing in the state to make reproductive justice real for our communities. And we, when Jennifer invited us to do this talk at this time of year, we knew we would be having this conversation on the heels of the 49th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. And I'm sure if you're tuning into this conversation tonight, you're quite aware of the precarity of abortion care in the United States right now. And, the Supreme Court recently heard arguments about really restrictive bans in Texas, and they're hearing arguments in moving through the courts in Mississippi law, and they're set to rule on that this summer. And so that decision will likely reshape what abortion care looks like, what abortion care access looks like across the country. And so this is a really hard moment for anybody who believes in reproductive dignity and believes in the right to determine when and whether and with whom you create a family. But part of the work that we wanted to do tonight is to talk about reproductive justice. And reproductive justice, and Lena is going to elaborate a bit more, but reproductive justice is far more than just access to abortion care, and it's far more than access to birth control, comprehensive, compassionate, non-judgmental care. It is those things, but it is so much bigger than that. And so we wanted to take this moment to think about and talk with leaders in Iowa who are on the front lines of making reproductive justice real in our state, in the work that they do every single day as healthcare providers, as scholars and activists and policy advocates, and just amazing change makers. Their work inspires mine, and I'm so proud to be in community with them. And so I'm looking forward to this opportunity to talk tonight and to have, to elevate some of this work as critical to a just and a humane Iowa. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lena.
Thank you, Natalie and Jennifer and Jason, and to our incredible panelists. I'm thrilled that we're able to have this conversation, and we're hoping that it's one of many, and that Iowa and the work that our colleagues here are doing becomes a place that other states can look to see, how people create so much from so little. In a state that has increasingly refusing to fund critical access to care, right, and denying people care. And so with that, I really want to sort of first kind of explain a little bit what reproductive justice is, where it came from. It was a term that was coined by a coalition of activists, Black activists, Latinas, Native and Asian women in 1997 to push beyond notions of reproductive rights. Now, why did they do this? Although most people would say that people have rights to abortion or contraception, for instance, these rights do not necessarily grant people access to these things, right? And so furthermore, many of the women in this group also recognize that framing critical issues through the prism of reproductive choice was equally limiting, because this framework posits that all of us equally have can and have the means to make similar choices, right? Which is also not true. So what reproductive justice did is that it expanded some of these more commonly used frameworks to center people's bodily autonomy, and to support people who want to have children, to support people who do not want to have children, as well as helping create communities where people can parent the children we have in safe and sustainable ways, right? So this is a much more expansive understanding of what reproductive freedom means and reproductive justice means. And so we, Natalie and I had the pleasure, and actually I would honestly say the honor, to interview our three panelists for our piece in the book titled Maternal Theory. It's one of, I don't know, like 55 chapters on maternal theory, and our little chapter on reproductive justice in Iowa made it in, and it's really exciting. We hope to turn it into a larger project. But I think that the reason why, it was an honor for me to speak to these incredible panelists, because they are on the front lines doing the work that we are talking about, and it's complicated, often cruel work, because they're working with very marginalized communities, and so in a somewhat hostile place like Iowa. And so our panelists are engaging in reproductive justice in this framework in Iowa on various fronts. Our first panelist tonight is Lastasia Coleman. She's a native of Iowa and holds a terminal degree in nursing and is a certified nurse midwife and clinical assistant professor in the Department of OB-GYN in the College of Medicine at the University of Iowa. She is currently pursuing her PhD in public health. She's also the director, in her part-time, of the American College of Nurse Midwives Iowa affiliate. She's a board member of the Emma Goldman Clinic, and is active in the Iowa Maternal Quality Care Collaborative. She's also one of the founders of the Black Maternal Health Collective in Iowa. And I've abbreviated some of these bios because these folks are doing all sorts of things. Our next panelist is Nicole Novak, also originally from Iowa, who's appointed in the College of Public Health at the University of Iowa. Her research focuses on two critical issues related to reproductive health and justice, and that's the history of sterilization abuse in Iowa, as well as how immigration policies impact birth outcomes. And our third panelist is Megan Thompson, who's also a clinical assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Iowa. She's a doctor of nursing practice with a specialty in nurse midwifery care. She's a certified nurse midwife, a trained doula, and a certified lactation consultant. Her research focuses on reducing health disparities with an emphasis on substance use disorders and incarceration. And so what we want to do tonight is sort of open the floor up to our panelists, starting with Lastasia, to sort of meditate on, if you could, for us, how you've used the framework of reproductive justice in your research and in your community work, and why you think that frame is suitable for a place like Iowa, and you found it an empowering way to sort of address your work. So I'll welcome Lastasia.
Thank you so much, Lena. I'm really happy to be here tonight with all of you. So reproductive justice here in Iowa, I would say overall, my approach is to address it on a systems level while still thinking about the individuals living in the system in the current moment. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is on like the state level at the health department. Probably one of the more exciting projects that I'm currently working on is through the Title V agency at the health department to train and educate Black doulas So we're working on, having doulas be able to accompany women from different communities throughout the state where there are higher concentrations of Black folks, whether they're Black Americans or have immigrated or have sought refuge here in Iowa. And so we've trained through the program 15 doulas, and I think they have another training coming up here soon. And so they're kind of getting out and starting to do the work. My primary role on that project is as a consultant, working with kind of provider and nurse relations. And so we know doulas do fantastic things, especially when we can provide that cultural congruence, and our patients have better outcomes, whether that's reducing their C-section rate, just a better birth experience. One of the things about reproductive justice is reproductive rights is kind of the floor. That's like that should be our lowest bar. That's where it should start. And reproductive justice is like where it could be. And so I think, when we're thinking about people in the community, focusing more on thinking about how they can bring joy and satisfaction and like support and comfort into their pregnancy and birthing experiences, while on a systems level, like educating people about what disparities exist and what we can do to work towards eliminating those disparities. And so that's one thing I would say. And that probably the other big thing that I'm working on right now is starting a midwifery education program here in Iowa. One of the tenets of reproductive justice is you get to choose your birthing environment. And so women and birthing people want midwives, and there's not that many of us. And so one of the ways we can impact that is by educating more people to become nurse midwives. And so that's what I'm working on.
Thank you so much, Lestassi. Nicole?
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you tonight. And I'll just say the community that Lena and Natalie have brought together over the last few years has been really nourishing and sustaining. So I'm glad to have a chance to share some of that with a broader audience. So yeah, as Lena mentioned, I'm research faculty in the College of Public Health. And I generally look kind of like Lestassi upstream at some of the systems. In my case, I often focus on state violence or other systemic injustices that result in health inequities, and I'm particularly passionate about reproductive health. At the risk of overloading you, I'm going to share two different projects tonight. I will just try to give taste of both of them, but it's actually really meaningful to me to have an opportunity to present them in tandem, because I see them as very interconnected, even though maybe a kind of more mainstream public health frame would consider them to be very different populations, time periods, methods, everything. But the reproductive justice framework helps really show how these very two different episodes in Iowa's history and present are interconnected. So the first project I want to share is from a partnership with a really wonderful local grassroots organization called the Prairie Lands Freedom Fund. I'd encourage you all to check it out. I will put their website in the chat. Often we co-present together due to family life circumstances, including my own reproduction. It's just me tonight, but they're wonderful, and I encourage you all to listen to them at any opportunity you have. So the Prairie Lands Freedom Fund was founded in 2017, and at this point it pays both immigration bond for people in immigration detention, as well as some pretrial bail for people who are in jail, pretrial detention in Iowa. And I would say that family has been one of the core organizing values and frames for this organization since the very beginning. And so when I first met them and started talking with them, they didn't use an explicitly reproductive justice frame, but family was extremely clear, because when someone is detained by ICE, at this point it's a civil detention, it's not a criminal arrest, but they're held in some cases in detention with a very high bond that has to be paid in order for them to be released while they wait for their court date. And family comes into play in two ways. First, just being in detention, they're separated from their family. And then the bonds, the average when this project started was $5,000 nationwide. And unlike criminal bail, there's not usually a bondsman system where you would pay 10%. It has to be paid in full, in cash, in Omaha. And so for a lot of families, this was prohibitive in a number of different ways, and meant that they couldn't pay the bond to get their family member home. And then the secondary impact is that when this is often the primary wage earner for the family, when they're detained, there's a lot of pressure to get back to working one way or another, and their court cases tend to move very quickly if they stay in detention. And unlike our criminal justice system, there's no guaranteed legal representation in the immigration court system. So often people end up getting pushed into either deportation or what is called voluntary departure, where they're removed from the United States. And so that leads to a much bigger family separation, obviously, and then all the other fallout of losing someone who's earning wages and just being hopefully a loving member of the family. So family has been just core to this project from the beginning. And we work together. This is a mix of the staff from the organization, some of the students at University of Iowa who joined us, and our loved ones. We had a lot of family picnics together. We very carefully over a long period of time developed what we call the storytelling project. It's reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, and the numbers down there. And the goal of this project was to really hear from people who had worked with the bond project after their case was totally closed and everything was done. If they wanted to, they could voluntarily, anonymously share their story. And it was really important to us that it be in first person, really pretty unstructured, whatever they felt was important to share. And then also that we centered their whole person, not just defining the family as a family that had had a detention, but just the whole family of whatever they wanted to share. So we actually made sure we spent a good amount of time talking about life before the detention happened and just what mattered. And I'd say, and once we started to hear the stories, people were often very passionate to share their experience. It became clear again that family was a core value before the detention happened, and then often made that family separation. And then ultimately the support of this organization, which paid the bond, it made it very meaningful because the family could be reunited. And then as some of the students were starting to go through and share with the organization some of the stories, it was actually members of the Prairie Lands Freedom Fund who said, oh, reproductive justice is all over this story, because it wasn't just about families being together, which is a core part of reproductive justice, raising families in safe and sustainable communities, but also often this is happening when families are at reproductive phases of their life. And so one thing that we did early on when we were starting to go through these stories is the organization did a reproductive justice campaign in conjunction with some organizing efforts to end ICE detention in Iowa. I'm going to paste the links to their campaign in the chat, but I'll just show you as an example one of them. So this is from an artist who's credited in the social media post, "Ya basta" means this is enough, and this person is dropping Border Patrol and ICE agents in the basura, in the trash. And then we included some of the stories with names changed that kind of illustrated why the violence of ICE detention is a reproductive justice issue in Iowa. So I'm going to read one of the stories. This is from a woman who we call Martina. She says, we had just found out that we were pregnant that Monday. I made a meal and I invited everyone. Nobody knew but me. And I surprised everyone by giving him the news that we were pregnant. We were happy. You know, it's funny how 1 minute you're happy and a couple days later, you're just bawling your eyes out, not knowing if he's going to come home. Her spouse was detained in a worksite arrest and was detained in Hardin County Jail in Eldora. And then this is not the only story we heard where pregnancies were affected. So she said, we went to go see him a couple of times at the jail. I almost lost the baby. I actually was starting to have a miscarriage type deal. I thought honestly that I had lost it. And that couldn't stop me. You know, I had to do what I could do. That day I came home, I told my kids, you know, their dad wasn't coming home. That was the hardest thing I had to do. So these are hard stories to share, but we also feel a big responsibility to share them because that was the family's wishes when they joined us for this project. So I will put in the chat the links. That's one of a few stories that we shared and we're continuing to pull together as a team. That really show the way that this, often we think of immigration enforcement. If we don't think about it a lot, we might just think of it as sort of like a legal action targeting individual people. And this makes very clear that there's so many ripple effects beyond the person themselves who is arrested or detained. And then let me put the link to the organization itself as well. I'd encourage you to get to know this wonderful group of folks. I'm sure I'm over time, but I will just briefly comment on the state of Iowa's eugenic sterilization law. So I'm part of a group across a number of different institutions founded by Alexandra Stern at the University of Michigan. That she's named the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, actually a co-director of the lab now. We began by creating a data set of the 20,000 people who were approved for sterilization under California's state eugenics law, which was active from 1909 to, it was on the books till 1979. We are a multidisciplinary team of historians, ethnic studies scholars. I'm an epidemiologist. I mean, many other people have come on board. And we try to document this history in both the scope and scale of it with quantitative methods, and then also the humanity of every person who is and sometimes reduced to a data point if we make a graph or something. And then as I was working on the California data, I started to look into Iowa's history and ended up getting approval from the state archives in Des Moines to see the Iowa Board of Eugenics records. So Iowa had a state eugenics sterilization law that was active from 1934 to 1974. It was led by the Iowa Board of Eugenics, and its intention was to prevent the reproduction of people who were considered unfit for reproduction. So early on, the law specified people with criminal convictions. There's also a lot of other, very hateful words that we would now consider quite hateful, related to people being maybe a threat to the public good, or a lot of judgments of people's sexual behavior, and then of course, disability and mental health. And so we went, I got an incredible group of students. When I asked for students who would be interested in working on this, we had a lot of interest. So I'll just show you a few pictures of us. This is our first day at the State Archives in Des Moines. They were a really incredible group. And I'll say a real core principle of the whole lab is to really honor that this is extremely heavy work. And so honestly, the 2-hour van ride to and from Des Moines kind of worked for us because we had a lot of time to just be together. And then we always took a break in the middle of data entry to just check in, see how people were doing, because it was heavy work. You can see what they did. So all the records are on these kind of index cards. And they gave us, archivists will be amazed, but they gave us permission to separate the letters of the alphabet that were all in one box into little recipe card boxes. So each student got a recipe card box with the letter of the alphabet. And they entered together over 2,000 people whose cases were reviewed by the Iowa Board of Eugenics, the most recent ones being in 1974. So just as some early descriptive data, these are the number of sterilizations per year that were reviewed by the Iowa Board of Eugenics. You can see it was primarily women and girls, peaking in the 50s, but also a good number of men throughout the entire period. And something really notable that some of the students are really taking on is looking at this surge in sterilizations at the very end of the board's activity, which is right around the time that the Iowa, the State Agency for People with Developmental Disabilities was being formed, and there was increasing disability rights advocacy in Iowa. So there's an interesting moment going on that a lot of the students are really digging into right now. Oh yeah, so anyhow, that is for me another example of the ways that if we have these kind of biases that exclude certain groups of people from being a full part of the community, it ends up playing out in how we treat families, how we treat people's ability to reproduce and be part of the community. And I'm really grateful to be part of a community that is trying to make sure that we remember that history. I know growing up in Iowa, I was not taught about it. And I think it's important. We actually estimate that many people are actually still alive who were affected by that policy. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I loved seeing my students' faces in your pictures. It's so exciting. They're doing such incredible work with you. And it's really just fabulous. Like, it warms my heart. Thank you. Megan, your turn.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. First and foremost, I guess I really don't think it's a surprise that two midwives are panelists today. Mostly because, as obviously I'm very proud of my profession, but I do feel as if reproductive justice is fundamental to midwifery. We kind of as a profession have always advocated for women. It wasn't always right, but I always feel like there was a group of people that were fierce advocates for autonomy and safety, which ultimately to me is how I view reproductive justice. Unlike Nicole and Lastasia, maybe my work in this field is a little bit more clinical right now, a little less policy shaping. I primarily work with people who have perinatal substance use disorders. And obviously there is quite a large intersection between substance use, mental health, and then incarceration. And so when we talk about, autonomy and we talk about safety, these folks are deprived of those things all the time and often very intentionally. And so, kind of talking about how this impacts our work is something as simple as advocating for a person to have birth control or not have birth control, to have that birth control taken out of their body when they want, for people to feel safe when they birth. So all of those things are kind of, how I kind of view this in my work. I was very fortunate to receive funding, and we created a maternal substance use disorder clinic. And as you can imagine, pregnant people with concurrent substance use and then mental illness, oftentimes people wish that they did not have autonomy. And so it is a constant, very interesting dynamic to care for folks that are often marginalized. Sometimes they are homeless, sometimes they are in domestic violence or, any type of community violence. And so kind of advocating for their autonomy within the system that we live in is just as fascinating, and often hurtful and traumatic as well. Specifically incarceration, I think both Lastasia and Nicole touched on this a little bit, but there is a long and significant history of forced sterilization for people. Oftentimes they would be told that they were going to have some kind of procedure, and they were never told that they would no longer be able to have children. And there's some evidence that is still happening today, although it is illegal. And what I'll say about folks that are birthing when they are incarcerated is that I can imagine very little less is more traumatic than that. Oftentimes people are not allowed access to even pregnancy tests if they are entering jail for the first 7 days. If they need a pregnancy test before that first week, oftentimes they have to pay. And often people that are incarcerated cannot afford that. If you find out that you are pregnant while incarcerated, each state has kind of different laws about it, but you can have access to an abortion. However, you have to pay for it, and oftentimes you have to pay for the transportation to get you there. So for our folks, depending on when they find out they're pregnant and when they ask and when they're able to get that, maybe they're paying for transportation and guards from, Mitchellville to here. And if people choose to stay pregnant in this state, they are actually not allowed to know when their prenatal appointments are, how frequently they're coming, what day they will be induced. If they have a vaginal delivery, they get to spend 48 hours in the hospital versus a C-section where they get to spend 3 days. And then their infant is taken away from them. And so when we think about reproductive justice, that is fundamentally not available to people that are incarcerated, that is intentional. But it specifically very much impacts people who enter the incarceration system pregnant or who become pregnant in the carceral system. And so I guess that is my passion. I don't know. Please tell me if there are other things that I should talk about, but reproductive justice is so essential to everything that we do, but specifically to perinatal substance use and incarceration.
I do actually have one question for our panelists before we sort of open it up, and I'll give, hopefully this gives folks a chance to please, put your questions in the Q&A in the chat, so we can get a robust conversation started. But one question I wanted to put out to folks is, given your sort of, right, like all of in the different sort of pockets that everyone's working in, what is something that, what is a policy or something that you keep running into in the state of Iowa that you're like, oh, if we just, if this thing was moved, we could do all these other things, that, it is one of those things that maybe, for folks who are more politically active, they could say, I'm going to start talking about this in these like political circles, right, that we can draw attention to. So, yeah, if, what would you say?
I can go first. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily just the state of Iowa, but one of the things that's probably most critical to address, at least issues that Megan and I are working on, is expansion and extension of Medicaid. And so especially in the postpartum period. So Iowa actually has the most generous federal poverty line cutoff for Medicaid during pregnancy, where folks can make up to 380% of the federal poverty line and still have access to Medicaid. It goes back down to 138% after they meet that 60 days postpartum as of right now. But some states have elected to extend Medicaid because there's strong data to support better outcomes within that first year after giving birth. So in Iowa, many of our maternal deaths are related to, maybe not necessarily cause, but related to substance use disorder, mental health, and suicide. And so getting that ongoing care, they may have established care during pregnancy, and once they lose coverage or aren't aware their coverage is continuing, which was in place and is still in place during the pandemic with some executive orders that do not allow Medicaid to drop people from their plans. They don't always know that they still have coverage. And so that's probably one of the most important things in that, and also getting rid of the Hyde Amendment.
Yes, Medicaid was first and foremost on my mind as well. I wish that Iowa would expand Medicaid to care for people who are incarcerated, because right now what happens is there is this awful thing called the Indigent Fund, which is state funding that goes to the prison and the jails to cover the medical care for people that they are currently caring for. And so when you have a limited pool, what happens is that you obviously have to ration, right? So you're choosing who's the priority, how they get it, when they get it, what it looks like, what meds you're able to offer in your own, kind of prison pharmacy. And so not only expanding Medicaid to cover at least a year postpartum, or shocking maybe everybody, I think providing that would enhance the services for folks that are incarcerated as well. The leading cause of there are new research articles published monthly that look at the latest data on maternal mortality and morbidity, and it is becoming very clear that it is actually violence, substance use, and mental health. And so anything that we can do to fund those programs would literally change lives.
I'll say in terms of reproductive health for non-citizens, there are endless policy changes that would be very helpful. Honestly, it's a very adverse policy environment right now. So there's absolutely like extending Medicaid. People's health clearly should matter regardless of where your citizenship is. Lately, I've personally felt very called to listen to people who are organizing on the ground, and that can look different ways. Sometimes it does mean advocating for policy change, but sometimes it means people looking for ways to mitigate the harms of these exclusive policies, because there's just urgent harm happening right now. So some examples, and the mitigation is always imperfect. Honestly, the partnership with the Prairie Lands Freedom Fund is exactly that. They're intervening on an unjust and exclusive immigration system to try to reduce its harms to families. And the main outcome of the storytelling project is that paying a bond does not solve all the problems, but it does make things a little bit less bad. And then honestly, a big theory of change for that organization is that you're paying bond as an organizing tool and not just to kind of help one family at a time. But the storytelling project is part of building a broader momentum and narrative about how these harms are happening, even in rural Iowa. It's not just a border issue. Yeah, so I'm inclined to keep my ear to organizers right now. I think another group that I found very motivating and I've tried to keep relationship with is the children of meatpacking workers in Iowa who got very politically active in the early days of the COVID pandemic. And I think that there's a lot of knowledge and energy and wisdom coming from people whose families are directly affected. And yeah, the policies that we change might be local. They might be building momentum for state policies, but seeing people's strategy for reducing these harms as soon as possible is very compelling to me right now.
I'll jump in with a bit of a follow-up to Lena's question. And for those of you who are still in the audience, we welcome your questions in the Q&A chat. You can just drop those in there. I too was really thinking, as LaSasia invited us to do very early on the systems level, and thinking about policy shifts, cultural shifts. And Lena asked about like what, if there was a policy you could really kind of, move forward, what would it be? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the, like, if you have seen, what kinds of shifts, cultural shifts have you seen in the time that you've been doing this work that has like, I guess either, for better or worse impacted these issues, but if there are things that you're seeing kind of on the ground, cultural shifts, cultural conversations, like where are we at with some of these conversations? Because I think part of, I draw so much inspiration from the work that you all do because of because it's trying to make RJ real. And I'm curious what things you've seen change in the time you've spent, the incredible investment that you've spent doing this work.
I would say change is slow, but I do think that there is a shift to working more towards different types of initiatives that actually address health inequities and health disparities. And with the funding that we got through the HRSA grant that the Iowa Department of Public Health got, that's funding the midwifery education program kind of launch, and amongst many other things. I think that approach where most of the birthing hospitals in the state are part of the Iowa Maternal Quality Care Collaborative, which was another project that resulted from the grant. There's just more information circulating with people who are leaders throughout the state on their units, just to keep them in the loop about some of this data. I mean, you can really get, in your rut at work and not really know what's going on with a broader picture. And so that's one thing I'm hopeful for with the IMQCC, is that people will just have more continuous awareness about, stats in Iowa, what's going on, what options and opportunities are available for improving things.
I guess I would agree with Lastasia that IMQCC is a game changer as far as drawing attention to issues. And they do have a substance use and a mental health bundle nationwide that will eventually be rolled out here. I would also just say that there is more attention being drawn to like the non traditional medical model. Like even just an article looking at like domestic violence being the leading killer of women in the postpartum or perinatal period is huge. And how long has that been the case? And it's never been published on before. So there is a shift. It's coming. I also think, people are educating themselves more and more on what kind of provider that they want and what kind of birth that they want. And I think especially as midwives here, we're seeing our numbers explode. People know all of a sudden who we are and what we do and what we're about, and they're coming to find us. And so I think that is really cool.
I got to work on a project for the Iowa Department of Public Health last spring. They're trying to be more aware of community-driven actions and strategies and pursue more partnerships. And that's a very important and something you want to go about in a careful way. But we tried to scan all the different community organizations all over the state that are trying to serve different communities, different subpopulations in each city, including communities of color, including immigrants and refugees, including the LGBTQ community. And just doing that scan was very exciting. We had a number of students at the college involved, and just seeing all the momentum, and including a lot of new organizations, a lot of organizations led by youth, and a lot of people who have been doing very good work for a very long time. So I think that's something that I found really heartening.
Well, we're getting some questions in the Q&A, but our amazing panelists are answering questions and typing questions at the same time. So there's one here that's kind of open-ended for everyone. And it's from Maggie. Hi, Maggie. And it says, hi all, my worlds are colliding. You're all amazing. I'm wondering what motivates you the most to continue your important work in a state that is continuing to place barriers to access to reproductive justice, especially in the COVID area. What keeps you motivated these days?
I think for me, it's just that the work isn't done. And so I've started a lot of things and I haven't finished them yet. And so I would like to see them through.
That resonates very much. I agree.
I will also say, I think daddy issues, I say that all the time, but I think that's like my motivator for life. Probably every person on this call is a high achiever. We see something that's wrong with the system, and we're here to fix it, damn it. Even if it is at 7:51 p.m. And so I think, people's stories, community, getting to be here with everybody, the fact that all of you are listening to this on Wednesday, that's amazing. Thank you for giving your time. So this is kind of obviously what motivates me.
I was recently talking to a friend of mine who is also trying to finish her book, and we were laughing because I said, never underestimate rage as something to motivate you to get things done. And she found a picture today that she's going to use for her book. And the quote underneath the picture was, I took this picture out of rage. And she's like, everybody's taking like everyone does such amazing things out of rage. And I was like, yes, it's profoundly motivating. And yes, we want to see things finished, but also injustice is, acting in the face of injustice, I think, is one of the things that keeps at least me motivated. And I know many of you, given what you've all been working on, right? I know everyone's really tired.
At the risk of sounding like a broken
Rage.
record, I'll just say like community partnerships too, and seeing like the women in the meatpacking town who are organizing vaccine drives at the local Buddhist temple, and people who are just every day out there. There's women who are trying to learn some Micronesian because people moved from Micronesia to work at the Tyson plant in their town. Things like that. I think I also find very motivating. That there's people doing this work every day, and it would be so nice if there were a few less things that they had to work against.
I feel like everyone's questions are being answered. Are there any more questions? Natalie, do you have any questions? Comments?
I have a question. So I think I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me, but I think the title of your chapter was something that's specific to the Midwest. Is that correct? So the issues that have been being described tonight, I mean, I know I've heard little variations of like statistics to, specific to Iowa and stuff, but much of what each of you has been talking about is this occurring, nationwide, or there are issues that you're really seeing are quite specific to the Midwest or to Iowa that feel somehow different here?
I will do a brief rant about, I think having grown up in Iowa, I'm aware with kind of the picture of the state that I was presented with growing up. And I think I can see now the way that, for example, not being taught some of the more harmful parts of our history. And then today, the way that these myths about Iowa as a white place continue to cause a lot of harm, and in both at individual interpersonal level and also in the types of policies that are getting implemented and the type of conversation we're having about our state. So I think that is, every place has its own challenges with its dishonesty about itself and its history, but I do think Iowa has its own unique reckoning to do.
If I could add, and maybe Lena wants to jump in here, because really the chapter was titled Reproductive Justice in the Heartland, and it was Lena's brilliant vision for this chapter that kind of catalyzed the interviews. And part of what we were talking about when we wanted to write about this was that, as Nicole was talking about, like there are lots of myths around Iowa as an exclusively white place, as an exclusively as a nice place, as flyover country, as places that just get ignored until the primary season rolls around, and places also where radical work is not being done. And so kind of part of what we wanted to do was to take some of the focus that often happens on coasts to think about, like, well, what is the real work of reproductive justice that people are doing right here in our communities to make them more just? And so, yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Lena, at all.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, with my dear friend who, she and I were talking about rage, my friend Ashley Howard, who teaches in the history department and in African-American studies at the University of Iowa, who's writing a book about the Midwest and violence. We've talked often about the sort of whiteness under which people think about the Midwest, right? Like when people think about Detroit, right? It's hard for them to realize, like we're talking about Michigan, this is the Midwest, right? When people think about places where people of color live, oftentimes somehow it's like they want to cut them out of the Midwestern map. And so part of what I was hoping to do with the chapter is put people of color back in the Midwest to have, in some ways, to sort of explode the notion of this sort of rural white heartland place, right? To explode that myth. And to, on the one hand, show the injustices that occur almost like as a laboratory, right? Iowa, I feel like, is on par with Texas to see who can be most cruel to those on the margins, right? I mean, they really seek to sort of outdo each other. And I'm reminded that just recently the governor sent, I don't remember, something like 19,000 troops down to help people on the border, to help Texas, right? So this sort of, there's this connection there. And so how to push back on that heartland myth on the one hand, but also to share the work of colleagues who are working with these communities, right? And so to show the tension that exists and will continue to exist, right? Given the politics and the turn that the state is sort of going in. Mm-hmm. And we want to, I was going to say, and we're going to continue doing this work with our Obermann Center group. In fact, part of it is that we're hoping to put together an edited volume that really extends this. We have so many different folks in our group, and we hope to hear from all of them in various chapters in that edited volume. So keep your eyes peeled. Coming to you soon.
That was my final question, was what is kind of the follow-up, because you mentioned doing more. How many people are in the group? I assume there's others.
A lot. I mean, it vacillates. Sometimes we have 12, sometimes we have 20.
We also, I was just looking at our listserv the other day because somehow I'm managing that, although I'm terrible with technology. But we do have 40 people and they're fairly active, you know. So I'm so grateful for this, the Obermann Center giving us this opportunity to get people together, because it's been a sustaining community for me personally.
Well, you're getting various accolades in the Q&A, so I hope you're all seeing those. And I think probably not surprisingly, there's just a lot of people here who are incredibly grateful for everybody's work. So, so I want to thank all 5 of you for spending this time tonight and sharing what you're doing, and then just simply for doing what you're doing. So thank you very much. And Jason, thank you too. And hopefully, just circling back, we'll see some of you on February 16th for the conversation about Ukraine. And Lena and Natalie, thanks for putting this together. So have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Thanks all. Thank you, panelists. Bye, everybody. Thank you.